This is Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain on PC, a decade-old 7th gen title that, while not perfect, delivers some of the richest optimized visuals in graphics history, and it's in desperate need of discussion. For instance, the animated reflection in the glasses, that's a real reflection showing what's happening behind the camera. The majority of this video will show how the GPU creates most of the content on screen, but for reference, the reflection is created in the exact same way, just at a much smaller resolution. But this is just a cool use of planar reflections in cutscenes. The richness expressed in environments is where things get much more interesting, as similarly to Half-Life Alyx, this is one of those rare games that delivers highly immersive physically based shaded visuals without abusing a hideous, incompetently designed ghosting TA. And while this game only uses Lambert and normalized blend Phong, another game the Phantom Pain is similar to is the Callisto Protocol, as both these games built their graphics with a culture that utilized photographic validation, something that tends to be missing in modern graphic papers such as this one. Both games use ID buffers to enhance BRDF expressions, but unlike the Callisto Protocol, which only does this for select character assets, the Phantom Pain enhances as many materials on screen as often as possible with material IDs, and many more Fox Engine specific topics will be explained as we go through the steps of how this high action frame was created on the GPU. First, 12 render targets are cleared, including a small RGBA16 that has the current volumetric fog lookup table output written to it. Then, terrain depth is rendered into a 64-bit depth stencil buffer to prevent shading work behind these pixels. The large occluding nature of terrain makes it the best arbitrary mesh classification for a partial prepass, but a more modern and optimized solution would also draw objects beyond a certain size threshold, and that would only require drawing around 50 other objects, which would cost around 0.3 milliseconds at most. But all of this cost around a full millisecond because these are base pass draws, where depth and deferred G buffers are shaded with textures. To take advantage of all the new additional depth provided through the rest of the base pass draws, the pre-passed content is shaded last in the base pass just before decals. The most expensive decal shades the most amount of pixels due to being so close to the camera, but also because the simple geometry creates tons of pixel shader invocations. Now, to quickly stress the importance of a more aggressive partial prepass, let's analyze the most expensive geometry draw, which has its cost multiplied by several fairly large blended textures. By isolating how many pixels the draw actually rendered, and measuring how much was overwritten by later opaque draws, we can find that pre-passing the large geometry would have reduced the cost by 50%. Almost every material, including a few sky shading draws, use a BGRA8, storing an 8x8 Bayer matrix. This is used for things like LED transitions, hair, fade transitions, and alpha-tested edges, in place of alpha-to-covered sampling, which is most likely meant to abuse FXAA's subpix property. The Fox engine almost never uses the RGBA8 format, and instead uses the letter-swapped version, BGRA8 format. The important thing to remember here is that these have the same bit equivalency. The first render target's alpha prevents decal shading in certain areas. The albedo is extremely interesting, as it holds projected cube map information for select highly reflective materials that have cube maps assigned to their material draw. The alpha of the second G buffer is a cube map intensity mask, which is mostly unrelated to the cube map infused albedo buffer, and would be more relevant during the sun-moon shading, where a global reflection map is in use. But it doesn't actually affect the specular lighting stage. In multiple experiments with dry scenes, no difference in shading is ever found. When it rains, a specific cube map is used, which you can easily identify when the mip-map clamp is toggled. Again, modifying the cube map intensity seems to have no effect on lighting, so it seems pretty wasteful in most conditions. The last render target is quite interesting. The 8-bit roughness and opacity buffers are pretty standard, but there is no 8-bit metallic buffer as the cube map albedo and reflection threshold don't really replace it. Typical AO is not supported either, and lastly, there is no 8-bit channel representing specular, which expresses an index of refraction, a quantifiable property in real materials. Unreal's documentation suggests to its users to never modify the specular input outside of cavity maps and select materials like skin and hair, which is why in many Unreal games, the specular buffer is heavily underutilized, resulting in major loss in visual richness and identifiable material uniqueness. The Phantom Pain's G-buffer layout is catered to Fox Engine's unique approach to resolving deferred lighting. The lighting stage doesn't need the extra 24 bits of base color information for the diffuse lighting, as it can just blend the information during the resolve stage. Omitting the base color information is one of the biggest and highly unique optimizations present in the Fox Engine's deferred renderer. But a specular buffer has to be generated as well, and metals, like gold, reflect colored specular information. The specular calculation can't derive that color from an albedo that isn't a lighting input, and it can't resolve it from the QMAP contaminated values in the albedo QMAP buffer. So during the lighting stage, the shader references the pixel's material ID, which directs the shader to a small lookup table containing material enriching parameters for that ID. This is where the specular calculation gets the specular color without a massive G buffer. The specular albedo channel controls how strong the intensity of that colored specular reflection is. The material index and ID buffer is crucial in explaining how this 8-bit buffer is representing 24-bit albedo values. Since this buffer controls the specular intensity, specular occlusion and cavity maps are heavily utilized in this game, which puts the visuals far ahead than most modern titles. Materials with a hair ID represent a different value relating to anisotropic shading. This compact G-buffer format also helps relieve the amount of texture inputs needed for general asset texture packing. Let's analyze this asset that draws in the back. This is a good texture set to analyze as it also contains metallic patches. This is hard to see with a primary capture, which is why we took a dedicated capture of the mesh in the game. The general asset compression scheme is equivalent to the TI compression scheme with the BC7 removed, and is similar to the fastest compression scheme measured by Motive Studios, but with one additional BC4. This is very apparent when measuring the extremely optimized cost to pixel shading ratio. Outside of assigned cube maps in the Bayer matrix texture, some objects will of course use extra textures in addition to the general packing scheme. 3 render targets are cleared and the depth is copied to a half-resolution buffer. Certain objects are rendered again to shade their velocity in a BGRA8. In other areas, certain animated trees will be re-rendered here as well. All objects in the velocity pass also write to the depth stencil. Several render target clears are called just before several operations. The velocity render target in the depth buffer is used to create full-screen low-precision 8-bit motion stored exclusively in another BGRA8 blue and alpha channel. Using the native resolution depth in an RG16 noise texture, linear depth is stored in half-res RGB bits, while the alpha stores the noisy line integral SSAO. By storing the AO and depth together, only a single input needs to be used during the SSAO smoothing until it's shaded on a native res BGRA8. Then the 64-bit depth is copied to a native res D24S8 buffer to be used alongside the native res normals for the half-res ambient obscurance SSAO shading. Note that the AO before didn't use the normals. The same depth pairing technique is used for the blurring passes, but 16 bits does suggest lower quality input than the 24-bit RGB approach. The last compute shader uses the 64-bit depth to upscale the half-res SSAO outputs to a native res R8 buffer. Then, using no textures and only small single triangle draws, a small RGBA16 atlas has indirect lighting probes rendered inside of it, and this is used in various draws alongside the native depth, normals, and various box-like geometry to shade the indirect lighting in a half-res RGBA16. This is exactly what's stated in the 2013 presentation. This is followed by spherical harmonic occlusion boxes, which are rendered inside a half-res BGRA8. The indirect lighting buffer is copied to another half-res RGBA16 so that global skylighting can be shaded on the original copy. It's easy to see the skylighting's full effect when the indirect probes are disabled. Only using the native depth in a 4x4 BGRA8, the half-res indirect lighting is upscaled to a native res RGBA16 where all diffused direct lighting will reside. Upscaling from the depth in such a naive fashion does pose some issues in darker areas, causing indirectly lit objects to look severely low-res and pixelated. After this process, the buffer is used to store direct diffuse lighting, as we can observe with these non-shadowed direct lighting draws, which, as we discussed earlier, also output to a second RGBA16 containing the direct specular lighting. These are the light bounds for the unshadowed lights, but each light renders a stencil first to minimize the lighting draw pixel shading. As the lighting is shaded, the stencil value is simultaneously reverted. The same is done for shadowed lights, which are processed in this portion. The first step for each light is clearing a reused 4096 squared D24S8 shadow map, which adds up to quite a bit. 4096 squared shadows are not optimized, but they are tied to distant shadow rendering, which is the only appropriate visual output for modern rendering. What's amazing is the clearing cost is the biggest issue with the 4K shadow maps, as 16 high-resolution shadows are computed in almost a single millisecond. An extra 0.24 milliseconds worth of shadow rendering cost exists only because of two complex alpha-tested tree leaf meshes. One could have been logically excluded using perspective reference culling, and the other could have been rendered in a smaller shadow map, as these distant shadows shouldn't be so high-res to begin with. Also, enough performance studies have shown that the albedo and opacity should have been separated so that depth processing isn't forced to process RGB contents it doesn't need. As repeatedly advised on this channel, floor and ground meshes are excluded from the shadow passes to greatly enhance shadow performance, and one of the few shadows that neglects this suffers greatly. But floor and ground meshes don't actually have shadow casting disabled. This is just an automated benefit provided through front-face triangle culling enabled in the shadow passes. This is a dated technique used to minimize shadow acne when minimizing shadow Peter panning. Without shadows, objects look like floating PNGs. Fox Engine provides very accurate contact between the shadow and casting object, but because shadow casting methods hadn't progressed enough back in 2015 like they have now, this would cause objects to perceive their own shadows in a moire pattern if back-facing triangles were culled instead. Even though performance benefits are provided through front-face culling, many games don't use this because of annoying inaccuracy artifacts, which we can point out using this shadow map. Front-face culling is too naive, and it can't provide accurate shadow casting as many important triangles relating to the lips, nose, and face aren't drawn, causing these areas in the lit scene to be a little bit too glowy, causing a dated and uncanny appearance. With back-face culling, much richer lighting is provided. These issues will apply to environment lighting, but after analyzing how much front-face culling helps prevent floor shading while providing lumpy terrain and ground meshes cast cheap, minimal shadows, it became very clear that both types of culling need to be used in modern games, and modern game engines need to expose the culling mode to artists and developers to enhance optimization workflows. Shadowed light draws use the same inputs as non-shadowed lights, but use the depth stencil shadow map as an additional input, such as the spotlight. The stencil bound is extremely large, and we can see how the original motion vector stencils are intelligently retained. As the lighting draw shades the diffuse and specular, it also reverts the stenciled motion to their original values for the next light operation. A full-screen, non-shadowed light cost is actually quite typical despite using such a minimal G-buffer layout, but a full-screen stencil will always remain extremely cheap, as stenciling is designed to be as fast as possible on modern GPUs. Full-screen direct lighting is only increased by around 40 microseconds regardless of the shadow map size, which actually highlights how efficient we became at optimizing shadow projection during 2019 with Days Gone's timing. But all of this is being measured to show how efficient the stencil operation is, as Unreal Engine 5 doesn't implement this in its deferred renderer. The lighting draw will invoke expensive lighting draw pixel shaders over pixels regardless if that pixel is even within the light range. Unreal still creates a projected stencil, but only for the shadow masking draw, and it's not even stenciling within the actual light bound, bloating the already inefficient shadow masking invocations, which simultaneously clears the stencil before the lighting draw. With UE5 setup, even if you turn the camera away from lit surfaces, in a full screen scenario, you'll pay the cost for the shadow masking stencil, the invocation blocked shadow masking draw, and a massive cost from the lighting draw pixel invocations, simply because the lighting bound is within the camera view, instead of scaling the cost with pixels that actually need lighting evaluated, like the Fox Engine. Yes, the cost is reduced if lit surfaces are not in view, but it's still at least 4 times slower than Fox Engine's approach because stencil shading is more efficient in preventing GPU work. The DX12 lighting draws in Unreal can prevent invocations for unrelated surfaces without a stencil draw. But the problem with DX12 lighting draws is that direct lighting is 50% more expensive, so players and devs are screwed no matter what. Local shadowed lights in Fox Engine are shaded extremely fast, despite outputting to 2 large RGB A16 outputs. The most expensive light is the largest on screen. Next, an 8K 32-bit depth stencil cascaded shadow map atlas is cleared, There are some pretty big issues with this, but we'll discuss those at the end of the video, as this still renders 2 times faster than Days Gone's cascaded shadow map rendering. A new atlas is cleared so that small bits of a BC1 cube map are rendered inside of it, followed by a vertex-driven Fresnel mapping. The moonlight is only stenciled out to where the cascaded shadow map is relevant. Then that cube map is used alongside the shadow atlas and a white noise texture for shading. The white noise texture exists for a rare yet hideous type of shadow transition present in the game. The cube map atlas, or specifically sun reflection map, is expressed in the specular channel, and it's the main source of reflective output, at least during dry weather, but it can create an unnatural blue tint everywhere in the scene. Using the ID map in the second render target, a native res copy of the diffuse RGBA16 is made, but the alpha now contains a mask that guides the 2 subsurface skin blurring draws. Modern techniques can actually do this step much faster than in Fox Engine. Excluding pixel invocations for sky pixels, the lighting buffers are then resolved, while simultaneously blending the fog lookup table and ambient occlusion. The RGB channels contain a 24-bit tone-mapped image, which will brighten a bit for better viewing here. The alpha doesn't go unwasted as it stores the pixel luminance for bloom. This resolve step takes about 0.4 milliseconds if the environment rain is enabled, as it makes use of the cube map shown earlier and all the base pass lighting buffers. There is some really cool evidence included in the description that suggests Phantom Pain's tone mapping is extremely similar to the GT tone mapper, and looking at the standalone tone mapped images suggests this was a major help in conveying competitive realism in today's bland ASIS-driven graphics economy. One of the main reverse engineers of Fox Engine said something I think everyone should hear. Tone mapping is not an artistic choice. It is the technical foundation for actual artistic changes like color grading. Then, the sky and emissives are rendered on top, followed by the duplication of the tone map frame. Then, using 3 of the main base pass buffers, 2 render targets have blank data written inside them, except for an SSR mask saved in the stencil channel, which is then used in the next draw alongside full res buffers for half-res SSR shading, which is then blurred and mip-mapped immediately after. The effect is quickly resolved on the tone map frame, only using the roughness stored G buffer as an additional input. It's a bit hard to see SSR in this frame, but it's very influential in well-lit scenes. Notice how the scene is enriched with high roughness reflections, something that UE5 SSR cannot provide, even on surfaces with several times higher specular value in much lower roughness than the material in Phantom Paint. Now you could pretend that the cost is similar in UE5, but the main SSR test scene in Phantom Paint evaluates traces on a much bigger surface area and shades SSR without any noise, officially making it more optimized. While I personally think the SSR should be brighter, the actual in-game effect almost borders into screen space GI territory, backing up our point about how viable SSGI enhanced probe lighting is. Next, a distant horizon mesh and other screen space effects are rendered on top of the tone map buffer. Then the diffuse buffer is used to create a 32x32 RGBA16 to be potentially processed by the CPU as discussed by Fox Engine reverse engineers. Auto exposure is another Fox Engine benefit of separating the diffuse lighting from the albedo. Bloom buffers are processed, followed by lens effects that are rendered on a half-resolution BGRA8 composite buffer, which is then blended with the tone map frame in 51 microseconds. Motion blur is then computed, first by mip-mapping the new velocity buffer, then the motion blur is shaded on a half-resolution BGRA8. Using the composite strength mask stored in the alpha of the half-resolution motion blur, the effect is blended with the native res frame. Bloom is combined with a color grading lookup table, followed by a poorly configured FXAA. This is a comparison of the clarity focus FXAA configuration discussed in a past video. The raw comparison along with an SMA version and several other before and after comparisons are available on our Patreon. FXAA is followed by the rendering of UI elements. The frame is then copied to an RGBA8 with an altered gamma for display output. The final budget is under 11 milliseconds, and there are some things that could easily be changed to enhance performance. But here are a few lessons regarding some of the assets. While BC3 packing isn't good for shadow rendering, there are also issues with the models used, such as this draw. As we learned from Days Gone's superior foliage rendering, close-up foliage LODs need to have accurate geometry cutouts, as that will minimize how pixel invocation bound foliage is. Now generally, GPU utilization will remain under 50% even in this jungle environment, but this particular area really highlights the issue with the very high shadows preset, as it increases GPU utilization by around 20%. This makes perfect sense, as tons of alpha testing is written in 4 different 4K shadow maps stored in an 8K atlas. We've previously discussed the solutions and better techniques for shadows, but some of those details have been documented a little bit better on this slide. Overall, the visual faults and strengths are pretty balanced, and even though some aspects are double-edged, the visual strengths tackle some of the biggest visual issues in today's games. We can easily pinpoint where the most important graphical updates the Fox engine would need implemented so that well-performing results could resemble the promotional renders, if not supersede them by a long shot. Before you click out of the video, note that it requires a massive amount of labor to compile complex data and comparisons like this. And we do so with unique critical thinking and use the same exact reasonable consumer level hardware in every video in order to create a library of performance standards. This wouldn't be possible without our current Patreon members. As much as it may annoy you to hear it, we need to see revenue growth from these efforts, and community support through Patreon is the best way to keep our work sustainable and spread the required culture that will support real progression. Consider helping us out by filling out this list with your name by the time we release our next video. Our videos are meant to be watched in order of release like a training course, and they are designed to create a new consumer and developer that can pinpoint modern neglect. Until then, subscribe to the channel and keep a lookout for the next video.